Nun Katherine grew up in the Episcopal Church in New York, but she embraced the Orthodox Christian faith while serving as a counselor for homeless families at a place that many of us know well, the Raphael House in San Francisco. In 1998, she was tonsured a nun and then continued to serve in a shelter. But the Lord has led her on quite an amazing journey from Northern California to Indiana, where she currently serves as the superior of the St. Xenia monastic community, which is underneath His Grace Bishop Longin in the Serbian Orthodox Christian Archdiocese in the Midwest. And I am pleased to say also, and this maybe has nothing to do with her talk, but Mother Katherine has had quite an impact on my family, personally, because, not so much for her writings, which are wonderful, and her speech today on racial identities and racism, which will also be incredible, but because of her music, actually. Because back in the day, when she and I first met, she came into this little Orthodox Christian bookstore and coffee house called the Elector Cafe, and she had a guitar. And she began to play a few songs, and she had a CD. And I won't embarrass her, but I could probably sing every word on that CD. Yeah, well, I don't know if it'd be neat to hear, but you know what's so funny is how God plants seeds in our life. And oftentimes, your song, one of your songs, and forgive me, the title escapes me now, I'm standing in front of everybody, but you speak about demons, dragons, and dinosaurs. What the devil are we preparing our children for? America the Beautiful, that's it. So beautiful. And you know, I have to tell you that sometimes God works even in those things that you don't expect. But I know for Matushka Jodi and I, that particular song and that record has been, in a way, it's like a bold black line on the gymnasium floor that we always kind of run back to. And then we sprint off into our, child rearing. And then we sprint back to things like that become touch points for the formation in the Orthodox faith. How are we raising our children? How are we forming our children's souls? And as we address these issues of identity and racism, we're really talking about a true and full Christian formation. And so I thank you for being here. I thank you for touching our family's life, and for, I know, what will happen for touching all of our lives today with what you will offer. Let us warmly welcome Mother Katherine.
Thank you. Previous 2 years, I spoke on loneliness, which was published as a book, and Mother Makaria has a couple of copies upstairs. I'm hoping that today's talk on racial identities and racism can be incorporated in a second book with a chapter on overcoming shame, the racial identities, and then how the prodigal's older brother welcomes him back. So, if you want to take notes and tell me later how I can improve the chapter, what you think would improve it, I would welcome that, and then maybe by next year there'll be another book. When I was a little girl in first grade, we children used to walk home from school for lunch. No school lunch program. Heading off together as a group one day, a little boy named Bruce commented loudly, "I don't walk with colored people." And I snapped around and looked at him as if that were the most patently ignorant thing I'd ever heard. And I volleyed back, "What do you think you are, transparent?" You see, even in those momentum-building years of the civil rights movements, my parents chose to leave me to my own intuitive, aesthetic perceptions of people's similarities and differences. I described a person's color as pink or brown, and that clash between my innocent childhood perception and the culturally imposed perception of my little classmate, that wasn't actually my first taste of racism because I had no context for his remark. I didn't have any sense of racial identity. I didn't categorize him as one of those people. He was just one child making a taunting remark, as kids do. 100 years ago, when my father was a young schoolboy in Savannah, a painful sense of racial identity was imposed on him through various experiences and interactions. that left him with a lifelong feeling of bitterness. But he chose as much as possible not to pass that on to the next generation. And for that protection of my innocence, I'm very grateful. So I still hold that my naive, childish view was essentially correct. While people come in a variety of colors, racism really doesn't make sense, does it? No. However, in our present decade, which marks 50 years from the civil rights movements and the achievements of the 60s, race again dominates the news. It looms big in our lives. It still has power to shape our worlds. Real evil done in the name of nonsense. Perhaps that's always been the case, and I failed to notice. Race is an organizing component of our experience in the US. To make sense of the wealth and diversity of materials on the topic, it's important to notice that the word race has had different meanings at different times with different thinkers. If we start, as I like to do, with the Bible and Bible commentaries, we'll quickly find that there's no biblical word or concept for race as we understand it now. The closest Greek word is phili, meaning tribe or clan, a kinship group such as the Arab people. Biblical commentaries and homilies based on the flood narrative, however, describe three families of people descending from Noah's three sons, and later ideas of racial divisions into Semites, Hamites, and Japhethites derive from this narrative. In terms of etymology, the English use of the word race to mean a group of people of common descent only dates from the 16th century. So that's 1500s till now, fairly recent. Before that, it meant kind or type. Didn't even have to be human beings. Any kind or type would be a race. During the age of exploration, when Europeans traveled around the globe discovering the enormous diversity in the expression of life and nature, they began to categorize plants, animals, minerals, and yes, people. Authors in the 17th and 18th centuries produced arguments for 4 or more races of mankind. There's never been a consensus. Many believe that the human race as a whole began from the same ancestor for either scientific or religious beliefs, for reasons, and others believe that different races evolved at different times in different places from different ancestors. The 19th century saw a rise in the concept of biological race with the Eugenics Movement. This movement advocated the improvement of the human race by breeding for desirable traits and eliminating negative traits from the gene pool. At least 30 states, Indiana was the first, passed eugenic laws, and now, although it's illegal in the United States, the practice has not fully died out. The 20th century saw the height, and fortunately the decline, of genetic racism. And now in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the study of the human genome has convinced some scientists that there's no biological basis for race at all. There seem to be more genetic differences within the so-called races than between them. Many social scientists today see race purely as a social construct, and I share this view. In the name of biology, we believe arbitrary distinctions based on human differences have been misconstrued as markers for significant differences in the areas of intelligence, behavior, and morals. To bring the meaning of race as a social construct to bear on our American experience, let us turn our attention to colonial Virginia. Now we're going to go back to the 17th century. The English colonized Virginia in 1607. That was the first U.S. colony. The first group of African laborers were baptized Christians with Spanish and Portuguese names and some familiarity with European culture. They were brought to Virginia in 1619 as indentured servants. According to the Black anthropologist Audrey Smedley, Africans came to be seen as indispensable to the plantations because, I quote her here, they had skills which neither the Indians nor the Irish had. The Africans brought here were farmers, not hunter-gatherers. They were farmers. They knew how to farm semi-tropical crops such as cotton, corn, sugarcane, and tobacco. They knew how to build houses. They were brick makers, for example. They were carpenters and calabash carvers and rope makers and leather workers. They were metal workers. They were people who knew how to smelt ore and get the iron out of it. They had so many skills we often don't recognize. But the colony leaders certainly recognized that, and they certainly gave high value to those slaves who had those skills. There was freedom in the early relationships between the Europeans and Africans. For example, intermarriage was an accepted common practice. I see a nod there, good. Professor Smedley wrote, "No stigma was associated with what we today call intermarriages." Along the eastern shore, 50% of the African men were married to European women. Enterprising Africans who fulfilled their terms of indenture could acquire land and become planters themselves, and some of them did. They participated in government on equal footing with their European counterparts. One famous family, that of Anthony Johnson and his 2 sons, owned more than 440 acres of land, and they also had 3 Africans, 3 Europeans, and 2 Indians as servants. They exercised the same rights as propertied Europeans. They participated in the assembly, the governing body of the colony, voted, served on juries, and socialized with the white planters. So how did we get where we are today? A discernible shift in the place of Africans in Virginia came in 1667. They began to be racialized. According to historian George Frederickson, when Virginia decreed in 1667 that converted slaves could be kept in bondage, not because they were actual heathens, but because they had heathen ancestry, the justification for black servitude was thus changed from religious status to something approaching race. Virginia during that time, from the late 17th to the early 18th centuries, was an unstable and turbulent settlement. Native Americans on all sides wanted to reclaim their ancestral lands. The greater part of the wealth and land were concentrated in the hands of the 5% wealthy English. Then, in 1676, a young Englishman named Nathaniel Bacon incited a rebellion against the governor of Virginia, his rallying cry being the need for greater security from the neighboring Indians, whose land free Europeans and Africans had taken. European and African indentured servants and freedmen joined the rebellion in large numbers. While the insurrection was eventually put down, it raised a great concern among the landed elite that the laborers would again unite against them to protest against other conditions. The wealthy planters wanted 2 things: cheap, easily controlled labor at a time when Europe was dwindling as a source of indentured servants, and they wanted to create separate factions among the laborers so that they could not mount a united front in rebellion. In 1672, to answer the need for cheap labor, England launched its own slave ships, directly trading in non-Christian slaves from Africa. The English considered it wrong to sell Christians into chattel slavery, although the day-to-day conditions for the indentured servants were just as bad, and most servants did not live out their indenture. Over several decades, more and more restrictive laws were passed regarding Africans who, because of their distinctive physical characteristics, could not just blend in. The Africans were no longer servants but chattel slaves. That is, they could be bought, sold, inherited, and their children and grandchildren were born into slavery. Even the free Africans were deprived of the vote which they had until 1723. To prevent future rebellious coalitions, the colonial leaders in Virginia laid the foundation for the invention of race and racial identities. They began to homogenize all Europeans, regardless of ethnicity, status, or social class, into a new category. The first time the term white, rather than Christian or ethnic names, English, Irish, Scots, Portuguese, so on, appeared in the public record was seen in a law passed in 1691 that prohibited marriage of Europeans with Negroes, Indians, and mulattoes. Theodore Allen, an independent historian, made these observations. Since it was impossible to maintain the hopes of the freedmen for upward social mobility in plantation society, the very resentment felt by the poor freemen on this account was to be manipulated in such a way as to set them at a distance from the bond laborers who had no hope of freedom. A new social status was to be contrived that would be the birthright not only of Anglos, but every Euro-American, a white identity designed not only to set them at a distance from the African American bond laborers, but at the same time to enlist European Americans of every class as active or at least passive supporters of capitalist agriculture based on chattel bond labor. The introduction of this counterfeit of social mobility was an act of social engineering, the essence of which was to reissue long-established common law rights incident on every free man, but in the form of white privileges: the presumption of liberty, the right to get married, the right to carry a gun, the right to read and write, the right to testify in legal proceedings, the right of self-directed physical mobility. The successful societal function of this status required not only African American bond laborers, but most emphatically, free African Americans to be excluded from it. It is that status and realigning of the labor class European Americans that transformed class oppression into racial oppression. It is worth noting that this was not a unique situation in history. The same dynamics held true, for example, in the relationship of the English with the Irish and the Dutch with the Indonesians. As events led toward the American Revolution, the colonists' view of slavery was complex. On the one hand, the English embraced an Enlightenment view of the rights of every man, and even the poorest Englishman knew that he had basic rights. On the other hand, there was a growing slave economy that thrived by taking those basic rights away from Africans. There were colonists who protested this from the beginning, and the more they protested, the more the slaveholders had to find justification for a practice that they saw as an economic necessity. How then did the justification of slavery gain momentum? Thomas Jefferson, according again to Professor Smedley, was the catalyst. In the 1780s, he published a book containing the first statement that really propels the colonies into trying to justify slavery. Jefferson says he's not sure but hazards a guess that Africans are naturally inferior. But, he says, we will not be able to know this until science gives us the answers. So he calls on science to examine human populations and determine not if, but that blacks are naturally inferior. And that's exactly what science does. Within a generation after Jefferson writes this, scholars are writing about the natural inferiority of Africans. Excuse me. I'm getting some nods from the political science expert over here, so I'm encouraged. In sum, over the course of several decades, there developed a polar shift in how Africans were seen and treated in the English American colonies. They went from being esteemed as invaluable, skilled, and dependable workers to being reviled as an inferior race that deserved to exist as slaves. Over the next century, the stereotype of Africans and their descendants was further abased by the pronouncement of a new scientific discipline, biological racialism. This scientific approach served to solidify the popular negative stereotypes of blacks. Samuel Morton, a physician and scientist, believed that skull volume was an indicator of intelligence. The larger the skull, the more intelligent the person. He used skull measurements to rank various races by intelligence. He also believed that the races were descended from different ancestors, ranking Europeans on top and Africans at the bottom, and other races in between. He was widely read, and one of his followers became a prestigious Harvard professor, training up a whole new generation of scientists in their views. Darwinism later challenged the belief in multiple human ancestors. Racism mixed with Christianity spawned some more ridiculous ideas in an attempt to reconcile the irreconcilable. According to Professor Gary Smith, during the days of slavery, Southern whites usually portrayed a segregated heaven where blacks continued to serve whites. Sermons sometimes described blacks' role in heaven as working in God's kitchen. Yep. Wesley Smith, who died in 1970, was a creationist proponent of white supremacist theology, if that's not a complete oxymoron. He asserted that only Caucasians had souls and that there was nothing other races could do to find favor with God and be saved. One version of this teaching is that other races were created along with the animals. Adam was Caucasian, and only his Caucasian descendants carried God's breath. His movement still has followers. At this point, we have touched just briefly on the development of racial consciousness and racism between the 17th century and the present day. Earlier, I mentioned in passing that African slavery met with resistance from the beginning. As slavery spread, so did the opposition. Here, I'd like to point out just a few forms that opposition took. During the decades before the Civil War, Christians of various denominations helped slaves escape on the Underground Railroad. Many Quakers were involved, and some prominently so. Thomas Garrett of Wilmington, Delaware, is said to have helped 2,700 slaves to freedom, and Levi Coffin of Cincinnati, the president of the Underground Railroad, helped over 2,000. There were various abolition groups, and finally in 1854, the Republican Party was launched with an anti-slavery platform. Harriet Beecher Stowe's controversial Uncle Tom's Cabin increased white empathy for blacks in the years leading to the Civil War. That's well known, I think, to many of us, but when she visited England as a celebrated author, she was presented with a 26-volume leather-bound petition signed by British women living all over the world, including the Duchess of Sutherland, the Countess of Shaftesbury, chambermaids, bakers' wives, begging their American sisters to immediately abolish slavery. 27 leather-bound volumes of petitions. So, some 100 years later, in the 1965 Selma marches, many non-blacks, including Archbishop Yakovos, risked their lives to answer Dr. Martin Luther King's plea for solidarity, and 2 gave their lives. And on the tragic evening of April 4th, 1968, after King was shot, Senator Robert F. Kennedy was on his way to Indianapolis, where I live, to make a presidential campaign speech in the heart of a black neighborhood, which is actually just a comfortable walk from the monastery. And Father Justin, I think I took you there. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Instead, he risked his safety there to announce King's death and to urge racial reconciliation. Over 100 U.S. cities erupted in riots. Indianapolis did not. Here, perhaps, is his most touching statement. For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and distrust at the injustice of such an act against all white people, I can only say that I feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand, to go beyond these rather difficult times. There is a walk-through monument in Kennedy King Park commemorating the event. And now it is time to turn our attention to the psychological aspects of racism. I want to remind you of the social control dimension of racism, the development of which we tracked in colonial Virginia, where there was just a small percentage of very wealthy and a large percentage of working poor. The elite, to protect themselves from the potentially volatile resentment of all the poor, created a buffer class from among their ranks. This buffer class was given the illusion of upward mobility by establishing an underclass beneath it and by creating a narrative to support that change. When I say a narrative, I mean a story that people can live their lives by. Notice that the racist system does not actually require the elite to believe in the narrative. They only have to protect their personal and financial advantage with propaganda and manipulation. One of the ways they do this is by encouraging the buffer class to engage extensively in what is called the psychological defense mechanism of projection. And here's how that works. In a family, in a work situation or social relationships, it's commonplace for people to blame others for faults they themselves exhibit. Maybe they just have a blind spot and don't see something in themselves. Other times, maybe people are too ashamed to see the negative traits in themselves, and so they project them onto other people. In colonial Virginia, when the white race and white privilege were invented for social control, poor whites were encouraged to project their sense of worthlessness and hopelessness onto blacks and coloreds of any stature. Again, through the defense of projection, black African slaves, both in America and even in the Arab world, were seen as unworthy of their lot because of their laziness by the very people who were too genteel to do their own work. So that's clearly projection. They were seen as worthy of enslavement because of their animal-like carnality by the very people who were abusing their women and children. So, or they were seen as worthy of their faith because of a lack of religious capacity by the very ones who were using their sacred text to justify abusing others. It could work back both ways. I mean, there's no reason that blacks couldn't have projections towards whites as well. So the manipulation that set the racist system in place caused wounds to blacks and whites as well. As we turn to consider the wounds of racism, we'll start with the wounds of the so-called master, returning to the writing of Thomas Jefferson. Our third president, who lived to see his own grandchildren beat a slave to death over a matter as inconsequential as breaking a cup, wrote the following: "The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions. Our children see this and learn to imitate it. From his cradle to his grave, he is learning to do what he sees others do. His parents storm, the child looks on, catches the lineaments of wrath, puts on the same airs in the circle of smaller slaves, gives loose to his worst of passions, and thus nursed, educated, and daily exercised in tyranny, cannot but be stamped by it with odious peculiarities. The man must be a prodigy who can retain his manners and morals undepraved by such circumstances." The racial wounds which we are more accustomed to think of pertain to the victim's sense of shame. I have a very distinct memory of walking along the streets of Harlem, where my father's church was, and where he was a longtime pastor. He always liked to engage people in conversations everywhere. We came up to a schoolboy. He must have been about 8 years old. And my father asked him what he would be when he grew up. And the boy replied, "Nothing." Already at such a young age, he felt defeated by the world. He expected nothing good from the future. He accepted the identity of shame and the paralysis of trauma that were just in the air in the ghetto. The shamed identity which blacks have developed in America is a result of racial trauma. This is because the universal initiation into slavery is traumatization. For men, this is usually accomplished by beatings, and for women, by sexual abuse. It is also caused by forcing people to observe the brutalization of others. This helpless observation engenders profound feelings of guilt and complicity. By causing individuals to feel helpless, hopeless, and totally overwhelmed by meaningless cruelty, and ongoing change can be wrought in the balance and function of their nervous systems, which is reflected in their changed personalities. The feeling of helplessness becomes chronic, and as a result, the victims then offer no resistance to the demands made of them. They have developed a slave mentality. The effects of chronic stress and trauma can be described medically in terms of neurological changes and psychologically. There's now something called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Scale. Carla, is that something you use? Okay. Researchers through this have learned that chronic stressors such as physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, neglect, separation from parents, substance abuse, or emotional imbalance in the family can have profound effect on the brain development and function of young children. Later, as adults, they will overreact to stress because their brains never developed the appropriate mechanism to turn off the stress hormones. Okay, so ongoing neurological and chemical changes. Unchecked, these hormones, especially cortisol, are neurotoxic. That means they can kill brain cells and thus cause even further injury. The nervous system imbalanced by early stress causes far-reaching effects in the immune system, emotional regulation, and relationships. So just about every dimension of our lives. Let's unpack this from an experiential point of view. Here are some of the long-term effects from ongoing psychological stress. People may experience changes in their emotional reactions. It can be a muting of emotional response, so a person just feels numb. It can be like riding a roller coaster, unable to regulate responses, explosive or extremely inhibited anger, compulsive or inhibited sexuality, or alternating between these things. It may include self-harming behaviors. Chronically traumatized people may lose their feeling of personal wholeness and connectedness with the world around them. Some actually describe it as feeling that there is a hole in their soul. They may feel at times that they are living in a trance or an unreal world. Because they are unable to integrate or digest their traumatic experiences, it is hard for them to learn new things or integrate new experiences. Ongoing abuse also initiates an altered relationship with the abuser, including a preoccupation with the relationship, idealizing the abuser, and sometimes even feeling grateful as if you were a benefactor. The victim may attribute total power to the abuser and accept his belief system and his rationalizations for the abuse. This is called traumatic bonding. We must realize that these changes, when they occur, do not improve with a simple passage of time. Without healing through divine grace and perhaps human agency as well, these changes in personality will be ongoing. All that we have said so far about trauma is from a collective therapeutic experience with wounded individuals. However, it can be applied to traumatized groups. Let us consider the wide-ranging effects that would occur if a whole generation within a national or ethnic group were to be traumatized. This has, in fact, been well studied regarding Jewish Holocaust survivors. Centuries earlier, the Atlantic Passage on the slave ships was a traumatic event for all captives, at least for those who even survived it. If then a whole generation was traumatized in this way, several of these changes would affect the capacity of people to develop stable marriages, to raise their children even outside of captivity, even if a significant proportion of the people suffered certain things, the changes would mark the personality of the whole group from that time forward. I think there are several changes which could have that impact. Changes in the regulation of anger and sexuality would be very important. So would be increased vulnerability towards addictions and other types of behavior harmful to themselves and their family. Equally important would be the diminished capacity for healthy bonding. Or the maintenance of stable, intimate relationships. The acceptance of the abuser's evaluation of themselves and of their group, and the suffering of shame, helplessness, and lack of initiative. The tendency towards trauma-induced learning disabilities would also have a major effect, especially where there were generational cycles of abuse. So is this traumatic profile beginning to sound like generations of broken homes, welfare, dropping out of school, addictions, and abusive behavior? Is it beginning to sound like the stereotype of African Americans? The knife of racist judgment continues to wound because, although disproven by science, it says these were the inherent qualities of Africans that made them inferior in the first place. These were the natural qualities that merited enslavement and brutal treatment. Without some knowledge of how propaganda holds racism in place and how trauma operates, the oppressed, the oppressor, and even those outside the system, neutral observers, may attribute trauma traits to natural inferiority. To add insult to injury, even today, Africans may blame the formerly enslaved for their fate. One African visiting our country said she was tired of hearing Black Americans lament over having been sold into slavery. She began to retort, the difference between you and me is we were just faster runners. So, yeah. So, if you traumatize a whole generation of any people, you can expect to find afterward unstable families, addictions, social upheaval, if you are looking from the outside, and if you are looking from the inside, feelings of shame and hopelessness. I'll turn to a different type of illustration. A follow-up study done on first responders to a terror incident provides a small-scale view of this dynamic. During the months after a tragedy, rescue workers suffered a substantial increase in substance abuse, divorces, suicide attempts, and other significant problems. This highlights the fact that not every individual needs to be a primary victim in order for trauma to affect the group as a whole. On the other hand, we're very fortunate. It is very fortunate for the human race that we are not subject to a blind determinism. In every generation, there are human beings who undergo brutal experiences without becoming emotionally traumatized or broken, as they said during slavery days. Frederick Douglass was one of these. He writes in his autobiography, about how they tried to break him and failed. However, not all slave masters are satisfied with compliant bodies. Some primarily want to remake the minds and souls of their captives. Accordingly, there are some captives, if I may make the distinction, who are traumatized but who nevertheless retain their integrity and values. There are even valiant souls who succumb to torture and betray their ethics but do not despair. They are able to turn again and stand firm for their beliefs. There are many people who, instead of losing faith in God, develop deeper faith, or even come to God for the first time. And now I'm thinking about some well-known Orthodox. Solzhenitsyn, the well-known Soviet author, came to Christ in exile in Kazakhstan after his imprisonment. Father George Calciu and Father Roman Braga of blessed memory were Orthodox priests who by divine grace discovered a depth of faith in the Romanian prison camps which they would have never found in freedom. So how can we become healed of these experiences? In the end, the one who depersonalizes becomes depersonalized. The one who dehumanizes becomes dehumanized. We maintain our personhood to the degree that we develop genuinely loving relationships with our neighbor. By loving relationships, I do not mean good or even strong feelings. Good, strong feelings coupled with selfishness are the recipe for abuse. By loving relationships, I mean relationships in which we practice treating others as we would like to be treated. In order to do that, really, Without an infinite variety of loopholes, we need to be able to identify with our neighbor, whoever that may be, and put ourselves in his or her situation. It is tempting to say that the second great commandment does not apply in this or that instance because the person in front of us is defective in some way and that his needs and feelings cannot therefore be considered on a par with our own. For those like myself who bear the scars of racism, I offer the reminder that while healing is good and desirable when possible, we will not be judged in the end for weakness and vulnerability, but for resentment and rancor. Not for what we have suffered, but for the suffering we have inflicted on others. Has suffering made us compassionate or vengeful? If over the course of time, suffering makes us compassionate, then although it was meant for evil against us, the all-powerful one has turned it into a good remedy for sin. Has suffering made us turn to God in prayer, or do we blame him for our fate? If suffering has made us turn to God in prayer, then we have a good fruit. The same events can have the opposite effect on different peoples according to their strengths and weaknesses. This is a deep mystery of the human soul. Throughout history, God has used traumatic events to show forth heroes, martyrs, and confessors for the truth. Conversely, it often happens in times of ease, abundance, and prosperity. With no external provocation, people deny him. Our responsibility is not to undo the past, which is impossible. Our responsibility is not to become what we would have been if the terrible events of our history had never happened. Our responsibility is to become better through our trials, by the aid of him who said, "My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." Every Christian has to fight an unseen spiritual battle. This is part of the battle to restrain our fallen, unruly desires and emotions. A traumatic past does not cause the battle, rather it is the trumpet call to arouse us to the contest. It does not cause the battle, but it chooses the field. If we come from a family with unstable relationships, we can work on our patience with others and on the deep issues of trust and bonding. If we come from a family with a legacy of child abuse, we can work to break the cycle. If we come from a family scarred by addictions and substance abuse, we can work personally on seeking the comfort which God gives to those who mourn instead of trying to escape their pain. If we come from a family that is embittered against God, we can work on putting the blame where it belongs, on the enemy of all mankind and on sin. Whatever scar or wound that we choose to offer to God for healing, we can know with certainty that the good work that we do on ourselves helps those around us to have the freedom to heal. The changes that each one makes for the good affect and help all. I would like to bring to mind that oft-quoted word from St. Mark the Ascetic, profitable to us no matter what our individual family legacies may be. The remembrance of God is suffering of heart endured in a spirit of devotion, but he who forgets God becomes self-indulgent and insensitive. Forgetfulness of our common creator, self-indulgence, and insensitivity to others are central to racism. But here also, in the words of this wise elder, we have the cure for our personal tendencies to use or abuse others. Remembrance of God with its attending pain of heart causes us to remember that we must one day die and appear before him to be judged according to how we have treated our neighbor. Forgetfulness of our own death allows us to stigmatize those who are weak, wounded, and suffering. We do not want to identify with them because that would mean that we are spared their fate, not by our own strength and control, but only by the mercy of God, which we know that we have not deserved. Remembrance of God develops a repentant attitude in our hearts on account of our own sins and shortcomings, and a humble attitude towards the shortcomings of our neighbor. Remembrance of God is the foundation of all the good things which we can accomplish or experience in life. An important conversation is recorded for us, a conversation between a spiritual father and a young man, the future Bishop Nikolai Velimirovich, who asked him, "Father, what is your main spiritual exercise?" The elder replied, "The perfect visualization of God's presence." Ever since then, Bishop Nikolai said later in life, "I have sought to achieve this visualization of God's presence, and little though I have succeeded, it has helped me enormously in keeping me from sin when I was in freedom and from despair when I was in prison. If we could preserve the vision of the invisible God, we would be happier, wiser, and stronger in every walk of life." There's little to add to Bishop Nikolai's words. Remembrance of the personal God is what is needed to keep us from sin when we are in freedom, and from despair when we are imprisoned, enslaved, persecuted, and abused. It gives meaning and dignity to all our sufferings. It cleanses all our wounds. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner.
Thank you, Mother. We'll entertain a few minutes of Q&A. If anybody has questions that they'd like to ask, if you'd stand up, say your name, where you're from.
My name is Justin Grimmond from Canada. Mother, first of all, I just want to thank you for your presentation. 3 years ago, I had the blessing and opportunity as a part of a Christian peacemaker team delegation to visit a reserve in Kenora, outside of, well, the closest city is Winnipeg in northern Ontario. And what I noticed was the same psychological effects of internalized racism among the Indigenous people. And so I guess my question is, based on your experience and research, in your estimation, what would you say to Euro-Americans or Euro-Canadians to assist them to become allies of, people of color? And what would you say to them to help them overcome the scourge of whiteness?
First of all, thank you, Reader Justin. First of all, I would ask them to think deeply about the part of the presentation where I talked about being manipulated into the category of whiteness. It has nothing to do with nature, it has nothing to do with biology, it has everything to do with social engineering. So look at how it comes about, look at how you were manipulated into it and how it is perpetuated. Look at the percentage of ultra-wealthy then and now, and just think about that. And think about who our real enemies are, because they're not humans. So a lot of that enmity is benefiting somebody else entirely.
Ephraim, you come stand up. Say your name and where you're from.
My name is Ephraim. I'm from North Carolina. Mother, I frequently observe within myself a lot of racism. I flee it by fleeing social media, internet usage, get rid of my TV. But it comes up anyway. It comes up all the time. It comes up just in reading the newspaper and hearing stuff on the radio. And I carry it to confession, but it comes up over and over again anyway. It comes up when I hear reports of the knockout game. It comes up even when I hear the term white privilege. And I ask you, how can I combat this?
Thank you, Brother Ephraim. White privilege, that term is getting bantered around in a very, very different way from what it meant when it first came about, and that's part of what I tried to bring up. So white privilege doesn't mean how many advantages do you have that I don't have. There's a lot of that on the social media now. It's an appropriation of the term and a change in the meaning, so that a person could say, well, you're black and you have a college education, you have this, that, and the other, so you have more privileges than I have, or something like that. So it can become a comparison game. Can you step a little aside so I can see Ephraim? Thank you, yeah. So it becomes a comparison game, and it can be a real irritant in that way. Is that part of the context in which you hear it about white privilege?
It just seems to be a thing of, because I was born white, I somehow have an automatic privilege over everyone who was born black. Because I haven't been to college except for a brief cooking, except for a one semester cooking certificate. I haven't been to college. It just seems to be you have white privilege because you were born white. And I'm like...
Well, in the 1600s, that was true. So when a racist system has an inception, and then it also ages so that it looks different after it's been in place for a while. So it does not look like what it looked like then. So if we had lived in the 1600s, that would have been true. And I have a lovely quote from an Indian, a Native American, talking about how even the most uneducated white man was superior to the most educated and refined Indian because of that very dynamic. But that's not true now. The system has changed, but the term has remained in place, and people are confused by what it means. So it's part of our historical legacy. But I could see why that term would be a real irritant now, because people are abusing it and twisting it and don't know where it came from and all sorts of things. So part of getting past that is delving a little more into the history of it. And yeah, keep going to confession, confess on behalf of, if your pastor is in favor of this, confess on behalf of family and ancestors, or whatever needs to happen, because it's not easy. It's not easy.
Give a proper definition, academic definition of what white privilege is. Because there's people who don't understand the historical and academic context of what it really means.
The question was, could you please give a proper definition of white privilege?
So white privilege began in colonial America when legislation was created that prevented blacks from marrying, from literacy. Maybe you can help me out. What other kind of law? There were several laws passed over a few decades. Voting, other things like that. Property ownership, so things that you would expect a normal person in freedom to be able to do, just an intuitive understanding of what it means to be a free person. These were legally denied to black people. So being a normal free person was reinvented as white privilege. So the ability to get married, to get educated, to own property, to bequeath it to your children was reissued as white privilege. Same thing happened when the English went into Ireland. They passed similar laws there against the Irish. So it's not unique in our situation, but it's long-standing.
Hiram Alexi.
Thank you, Mother Catherine, for your talk and your presentation. It's very, very helpful, inspiring, historically informed. I wanted to make one statement as a white person. The historical context of white privilege was definitely laid out in the 17th century. The most recent use of that term has come to light, especially by the work of Peggy McIntosh
Okay.
on an article called Unpacking White Privilege.
Right.
She gives there very, very clear examples of white privilege in our current culture. And I want to mention this just because of the fact that many, many groups will suffer because of lacking certain advantages that oftentimes are given to white males, especially in our culture. And this can be, you said, projected. And oftentimes it's projected onto people that don't have those privileges, as Ephraim was just speaking about.
Mm-hmm. Well
But
said.
I want to mention a couple of examples.
Yeah, please.
When I first met my wife, Mariska Michaela, right down the street at the Buy Right grocery store, she walked out of, this which isn't there anymore, of course, but she walked out and was unable to cash her check. At the time, I was selling mutual funds and insurance, had a three-piece suit on. I said, give me that check. So I walked right in there. I said, hi, I'd like to cash this check. It was her check. So they said, oh, sure, sir, no problem. They immediately cashed the check and give it to me. And it was my first experience with the dichotomy of this white privilege in our culture.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, down the street is Brother Ray Mabian. Brother Ray Mabian is a wonderful pastor. He's also a very well-educated pharmaceutical rep in the past. Now they have their own home health agency. But on many, many occasions, he's been pulled over driving through a neighborhood as a pharmaceutical rep for none other than DWB, driving while black. And I mention this because of the fact that this is, it's not something that needs to be stated for African Americans among us, but I hear this so often that I just want to state, I've never been pulled over because I've been white. In addition to that, many times people talk about the experience of going into a store, and because of the fact that they're black, they begin to walk through an aisle, and immediately some begins to follow them.
Yeah.
And so as a
that's
result,
definitely-
it's because of the fact of skin color. I can go into a place and people don't follow me because I'm white, and I have the extra privilege of wearing a rasa. And so I'm just explaining that there are these current issues, but that set of realities that I'm mentioning in our culture today is oftentimes projected onto people because of the fact that people recognize that I have suffered this, and you guys are the inheritors of these privileges. And so the thing that happens is oftentimes there's fallout through projection, again, like what just took place with you. Given that, what I think we really need to recognize is this responsibility for, as the scripture says, to whom much is given, much is expected. And to whom men entrust much, of him they will ask all the more. And so because of that, if there is some kind of social privilege currently that's given to one class of people, it means that we have a tremendous responsibility to do something else about it. And it was very powerful hearing you talk about these things today. On the other hand, I think that for most of us to be able to communicate that to European Americans, it's going to take white people, European Americans, to take this information, to really look at ourselves through the lens of what's happened in the trauma experience and in the experience of oppression, and begin to really work it through so then we can articulate it and communicate it to people like us as well. So I just wanted to make this comment.
That was very helpful. Thank you, Father Alexi.
Thank you, Father Alexi. We are going to end there, Mother Catherine. I'm sure there are many other questions, and I think our hearts are full to the brim.